Freddie Hayward, welcome to PoliticsJOE. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How would you like to introduce yourself to people who maybe aren't familiar with you?
So I'm the US correspondent for the New Statesman. I'm based out here in DC. Before I came, I was in Westminster, so I did the UK election, and I've been exiled out here for the US election.
What is the mood right now in DC?
Um, People I've texted this morning are in mild shock. Some of the Democrats are frustrated and angry at the campaign. I think there's a sense that, or a realization that Kamala's was not up to scratch. But there's an eerie quietness. As you got to remember that DC is mostly packed full of civil servants who, given the system, are likely to lose their jobs. So for many people in this town, it's extremely, extremely personal.
Talking a bit more about that blame, where did the Democrats go wrong with this campaign?
I mean, it was an awful campaign. I don't think you can deny that at all. You've got to go back to Joe Biden and his refusal to step down. That already damaged the image of the Democratic Party, perhaps irreparably. And then when he did step down, they appointed Kamala Harris with no primary, no scrutiny, at a point where everyone sort of recognized that she was a mediocre politician at best. I think the Democrats underestimated how annoyed people were about the fact that she was just put into the wrong. That came up at rallies, both Trump rallies and Harris rallies that I went to. And then from there, she decided to spend most of the campaign with cultural icons like Oprah Winfrey, Hollywood actors. She lent into the sort of online meme culture with Brad Summer. She let billionaires like Mark Cuban go on the news as surrogates to speak on her behalf every single day. She couldn't decide whether to drop or embrace Biden's record. She obviously should have put some distance between herself and the past 4 years, because the past 4 years have been extremely unpopular with many people. People are angry about the cost of living, they're angry about inflation. And when asked multiple times, it wasn't just a mere faux pas. When asked what else she would have done, what would she have done differently, she said probably nothing. And I mean, if you look at the polls and you see how angry people are, that is a bad strategy. If you're essentially saying to everyone, I know you're angry about this, but I wouldn't have done anything differently. You're essentially saying to them what you think isn't worthy of me listening to you. So I think from start to finish, it was an awful campaign. I think Harris as well has to bear some personal responsibility given the ineptitude of many of her performances. The
Mm.
debate was very good, I thought. That was sharp, and she baited Trump to a great extent. But if you look at some of the subsequent interviews, the town halls, particularly the recent CNN one, she hadn't thought through a specific answer to some of the most basic questions. You know,
Mm.
what sort of laws would you like to pass? What would you like to do in the first 100 days? Um, she just sort of garbled her way through that, and that was noticeable throughout the campaign. I think the only sort of saving grace was her strident position on abortion, and that was the clearest policy divide between the two, and the one area she made headway.
Mm. I think you touched on there that Kamala Harris was kind of leaning into this online meme culture. I mean, Trump also leaned very heavily into the online with his victory speech this morning, UK time. He had the head of the UFC, Dana White, on, who was thanking Joe Rogan, Adrian Ross, Theo Vaughn for Trump's win. What does that tell us about Trump's campaign, why it was successful, and in particular, what do you think it says about American men?
I think this was the election where the legacy media realized that it's no longer the mainstream media. I think it was the podcast election. If you look at the impact of some of the podcasts that both sides did, Kamala Harris did many podcasts as well, particularly Call Her Daddy, which is one of the biggest podcasts in America. Um, I think they both recognize how important that was. Trump did it earlier, better, and he also recognized that young men were more susceptible to his message. We have seen those gender divides play out in the polls. Most of this is actually based on the exit polls, so haven't really got the full raw data yet. But it seems as if, as expected, white college-educated women have gone to Harris, and young men, particularly ethnic minority men, have gone towards Trump. And it's very hard to draw a clear line between something like a Joe Rogan podcast and support for Donald Trump amongst young men. But I think the whole pitch, the whole atmosphere, the whole tone of the campaign is essentially directed at young men. What does it say about them? Well, I think it says there's an extremely polarized, divisive gender divide in America right now, and it's not secluded to degrees or education, which is what we saw in the past. It's become something much more fundamental, and I think that makes it much harder to bridge. I think we'll have to look at the data as we get it coming out of the election, but it's very it's I think people will be disconcerted by that.
I mean, that polarized gender divide, do you think that played into the fact that Kamala herself is a woman? Do you think that played into people's voting choices?
Maybe. I mean, it's really hard to tell. Trying to identify latent sexism through polling is tricky. I remember going to a Trump rally, and many people I spoke to used variations of words for prostitute to describe Kamala Harris. So there's obviously some sexism and misogyny in the campaign, but I think if the Democrats take that as the lesson from this election, then they would be not serving themselves very well. If the Democrats point at the rest of the country, the majority of whom have voted for their opponent, and just say that you're all racist and sexists and idiots, which is what many people at the Harris rallies that I went to said, then they're not going to do very well. We've got to remember as well, much of this election was really a class divide. If you look at some things such as Trump going to McDonald's, he loves to saturate himself in tastes, whether it's UFC or McDonald's or whatever it might be, or sort of garish fashion that makes professional upper middle class liberals uncomfortable. They don't like that, and I think that signals to people that he's on their side and not the side of this sort of laptop knowledge economy, whatever you want to call them, bohos. And I think that was as important, to be honest.
I mean, you touched on there that a lot of the kind of Kamala supporters were saying that Trump is racist, but as we touched on earlier as well, Trump has managed to expand his vote amongst ethnic minority groups. I think the statistic I heard was 1 in 3 ethnic minority voters was voting for Trump. Were you surprised that Trump has managed to build quite a large cultural coalition?
Not particularly, no. I mean, for the past 10 years, we've seen this in America, more white people going towards the Democrats and non-white people supporting Trump. So this is a continuation of that trend. I think there's a strange expectation that people who aren't white will support the Democrats, and that's one of the problems that they found themselves in this election and previous elections. I mean, if you look at the campaign that Harris ran, it's almost as if in some ways the past 8 years hadn't happened. As if you can just stand up on a stage and say, Goldman Sachs supports me, the experts support me, Nobel laureates support me. And people will go, oh yeah, we love those guys. We love Goldman Sachs, which is obviously not the case. So I found the campaign and the strategy to almost have this sort of collective amnesia around politics for the past 8 years. Same with Liz Cheney. I think the tactic there was to try and go for the sort of never Trumper, more centrist Republican conservatives. But that's not exactly the center of the country, is it? Invading Iraq and having sort of an economic system that produces something like 2008 is not where the center of the country is anymore. So I think that was a strategic error as well.
I wonder if that kind of, it sounds like you're touching on an almost anti-elitism is what has kind of fueled the support for Trump. And I wonder, when a lot of people in the UK and Europe look at what's happening in America and think, how can Americans be voting for a convicted felon, someone who lost a civil case revolving around a rape, someone that led an insurrection attempt. And we struggle to understand why Trump is so popular with American voters. Is it that anti-elitism, that class element you've touched on, that a lot of these commentators aren't seeing?
I think so, completely. There's lots of things going on though, and there's lots of different cohorts of voters for Trump. There's lots of people, for instance, who think that the economy was much better under him and they are feeling the pinch of the cost of living, and that's it. There are other people for whom it is purely immigration. They look at the border, they look at the huge numbers that have crossed under Biden's administration, and they don't like that. They think it's unsustainable. They don't like what's happening to their communities or whatever it might be. And then you've also got parts of society that which is I don't know how large it is, but you'll find it at Trump rallies, for instance, which are deeply conspiratorial. They're sort of bound up in chatter about the Illuminati or whatever it might be. So that's one aspect of it, but it's much broader than that, obviously. I think the class element is extremely prominent. And it's quite hard to quantify, but I think if you just listen to the tone, the sort of resentment on both sides of the other one, you can understand how a sense that there's one group in society that is doing extremely well in this economy. They have a high level of status, they're respected, and there's another level of society that feels like they're not. And I don't we should ever underestimate how powerful that has been, both in Britain and but also in America, I think, over the past 8 years. I think that's one of the most explanatory facets of this election.
Looking forward, now that Trump has won, what will this result mean for women in the US?
Well, I mean, it's hard to tell. I think on abortion, Trump has said during the campaign multiple times that he won't support a national abortion ban. I think the key thing is that you're not going to have a increased protections, which is what Harris was promising for the right to abortion. So there is a risk that it gets even worse for women. So yeah, it's not a very happy picture.
I think on that as well, what do you think that Trump's win will mean for the UK and its special relationship with the US, and also kind of expanding to Europe as a whole? What do you think it could mean for Ukraine?
Well, for the UK, it seems as if there's been some tension between Trump's campaign and Number 10. There was a lot of friction, I think slightly overhyped in the UK, because as soon as Trump's mentioned, everyone goes crazy. But there was certainly tension over the fact that Labour sent over some activists, and I don't think that helped very much. The ambassador here has done quite a good job in bridging that divide and facilitating, for instance, the meeting between Trump and Starmer in New York, I think back in September. So, but in terms of Ukraine, well, we don't know. I mean, Trump hasn't revealed his plan, but it sounds very much like he wants to end the war as quickly as possible. And in practice, that probably means forcing the Ukrainians and the Russians to come to an agreement that most probably means that Russia gets to keep some of the land it's taken. And I think more broadly, Europe will have to reckon with the fact that yet again it will need to take more responsibility for its own security. We've already seen a drift towards that with increased defense spending over recent years, in partly by Trump and partly by Ukraine. So I don't think that trend is going to shift. It's going to solidify this America is back rhetoric that Biden had for 4 years is now gone out the window, and I think his foreign policy and his diplomatic posture is now going to be remembered as a bit of an aberration.
Trump's former chief of staff, John Kelly, said that Trump meets the definition of fascist. Do you think that's something that we should be worried about now that he's in office?
I think we should be definitely worried about Trump's blatant, almost resentment or disdain for democracy. He doesn't think the rules apply to him. He still sees politics as he sees New York real estate, something where you can bend the rules and bully people to get your will. So, I mean, that's definitely a concern. I think there's also a debate about how helpful it was for Harris to spend the final 2 weeks of the election talking as if Trump or accusing Trump of being a fascist. I
Mm.
mean, it's there's been a strange part of the left that have assumed that for to communicate that something is bad, you have to use that label. And I think for many people, obviously, if you're considering supporting Trump, if you're a swing voter, if you're someone that might go for him on immigration or the economy or whatever it is, and then the opponent calls him a fascist, well, indirectly they're sort of calling you a fascist. So
Mm.
I don't think that was a very smart tactic. I think it exposed the fact that Harris had very little to talk about substantively for herself, and it was quite a desperate tactic. Whether he proves to be a fascist, I mean, I wouldn't claim to know, and let's see. I think the fact that he's extremely dangerous and resents democracy is clear for all to see.
What do you think the challenges faced by Trump when he immediately gets into the White House will be? Will it just be a rising inflation?
Well, inflation is getting increasingly under control in America. So, ironically, I think there are many people that will say that the economic growth and some of the indicators in the past couple of years have been very strong. It's just that Bannon has not got credit for that. I think on immigration, you've also seen Biden introduce some um, more stringent restrictions which has seen crossings fall, but from a very high level. I mean, what is Trump's policies? They're essentially, I want to tariff everything that comes into the country, so that's going to be extremely disruptive to the world economy if it comes to pass. He wants to deport millions and millions of illegal migrants. Again, it's going to be extremely hard to do, extremely disruptive, and potentially extremely brutal and violent. And he's also going to have to appoint his executive branch, his
Mm.
cabinet, his White House team. It was interesting watching the speech that you mentioned, his victory speech this morning. He was surrounded by his family, obviously, but he was also surrounded by some cultural figures.
Mhm.
But there's JD Vance there, his vice presidential pick, who some question was whether he was a good pick or not. Um, I think at least electorally that's been proven to be a
Mhm.
false concern. There is some talk about the fact that Donald Trump Jr. is ascendant in Trump circles at the moment, much more so than Ivanka, who's very much stepped away from
Mm.
politics now. So I don't know whether he will go into the White House, and it's reported that he won't do, but he's definitely exerting extreme amount of influence over the MAGA movement and over what Trump does. So he'll have to do that in the immediate term, but he'll also have to deal with, as we said, the wars in Ukraine and the wars in Israel and Gaza and Lebanon.
He mentioned in that speech there as well a role for RFK to make America healthy again. What do you think will be the role for kind of very fringe figures like RFK in the Trump White House?
Yeah, it's not yet clear. There was one interview with the Trump's chief transition staffer, and he essentially said, no, RFK is not going to get an official role. He's not going to be
Mm.
um, head of health or whatever it might be, but he is clearly going to have a lot of influence over policy. Trump reiterated that in his speech, which I think for lots of people he's making all these promises to lots of people, whether it's Musk or RFK or whoever it might be before the election, because he obviously needs their support. Is that going to maintain itself through the transition and then through the inauguration and the start of the presidency? I think that remains to be seen. As we know, Trump is extremely fickle, capricious, and I don't think it will. I don't think he'll have any problem with betraying a promise that he's made. But I think the broader point is that RFK's positions on health, whether that's his skepticism about vaccines or fluoride in the water that keeps people's teeth healthy, that's going to in some way imbue the Trump White House. I think that's clear, whether he gets a position or not. But it's the question will be how Trump brings together these quite disparate ideological threads within his coalition. You've got someone like Musk, who is a libertarian who wants to cut the state, who wants to let businesses run wild. And then you've got someone like a Kennedy Democrat like RFK, who obviously sees regulation as um, as important to whatever end you think that might be. So Trump's going to have to bring all these threads together, which I think which will be difficult, and he'll have to make some choices there. But yeah, he will the sort of the contours or the personalities, the identities in that White House team will be absolutely essential to what he does for the next 4 years.
Freddie Hayward, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.